There are no shortcuts in life. There generally are no shortcuts. And that's part of the illusion that I think a lot of people fall into nowadays. We are kind of programmed to believe that there are shortcuts in life, right? That you're going to win the lottery, you're going to be discovered if you work in, in Hollywood or in acting or in entertainment. You're going to be discovered, right? You're going to win the lottery. You're going to hit the jackpot, and somehow there's going to be a shortcut in which you will go from zero to hero. You'll have absolutely nothing, and then boom, you'll have absolutely everything. That's how we're programmed to think about things. And it's wrong. There are no shortcuts. There are moments where things that have been building up for a long time kind of burst forth suddenly. That's not a shortcut. All right. They talk about the straw that broke the camel's back. They talk about, the dike. Suddenly there's one little leak and then there's another, and then boom, the dike, there's a flood, right? There are moments where quantity into quality, etc., things just break open. But when they do, they're the result of a long period of plugging away and plugging away and plugging away and plugging away. And that there are very, very few circumstances where things just instantly happen. And that is not the way we're trained to think about things, right? We want it to be like a Hollywood movie. We want it to be exciting. We want it to be all of a sudden everything changes so dramatically. That is not generally the way things happen. And that if we're going to be serious about building a political movement in the United States, if we're going to be serious about spreading these ideas and getting anti-imperialism and socialism among the broad masses of people, we just kind of have to have a long-haul perspective. We have to think of things in a long-term way and understand that while we might gain here, and we might gain there, and we might have a setback here, we might have a setback there, that ultimately, until things completely are ripe, it's going to be just a gradual growth. That's generally what it's going to look like. Again, it won't be completely even. It won't be like every day we gain here and gain. And it won't be like that. There will be sudden surges ahead. There will be sudden setbacks. But until the moment where things ultimately come to their head, it's going to be more or less slow. And I've been thinking about a lot of different things in regards to this. Been thinking about Yi and his interview with Alex Jones. I've been thinking about Charlottesville and the alt-right and the demise of the alt-right. I've been thinking about January 6th and what happened with January 6th. I've been thinking about those things. And if you look at those events, and if you look at how things happened, January 6th, Charlottesville, and now I look at what's going on with Kanye. There's a pattern that we need to pay attention to. And this may not even sound like it even applies to us in any conceivable way. Right? This might sound like, Caleb, you're talking about people on the far right. Caleb, you're talking about Donald Trump, who was a president who was kind of a Bonapartist. Caleb, you're talking about a rapper who was anti-Semitic and now had a meltdown. You might think this doesn't apply, but in a weird way, it does. You see, Marxism is an actual political movement. And I've made this point many, many times, that when I go to countries around the world that have a strong communist party, it is a completely different thing than what we have in the United States. The communist parties around the world that have a huge amount of influence, they have neighborhoods that they control. They have people on a local level who meet every day and talk about the problems in the neighborhood and in the community and how to carry out the revolutionary agenda in their neighborhood and in their community. They have members of the elected bodies that are meeting with the Marxist leaders and talking to them. They have community organizations that are keeping track of everything locally in the neighborhood. That where Marxist and revolutionary groups have influence in the developing world, you go to India, where communists control the entire region of Kerala. You go to Latin America, where you have communist governments that are in power, or you have other countries where the communists, maybe they're not in power, but they have a huge amount of influence. They have huge political organizations. You're dealing with groups that are what I would call real movements, that have real roots among the population. They have geography that they control. They have neighborhoods. Just like in America, we have the red states that are for the Republicans, the blue states that are for the Democrats. In areas where communists actually matter, there is the neighborhood where the communists are in power. There is the region where the communists matter. Like there are geographical areas that are communist strongholds. That is something we don't have in the United States. That is something we just do not have in the United States. We don't have a real movement. We have a lot of people engaging in intellectual ideas. We have people who attend protests, mainly liberal protests, and try to push for communism within them. We have a lot of people on the internet doing things, but we don't have a real communist movement in the United States. And the ruling class has done everything in its power to make sure we don't have that. During the 1930s, in most major cities in the United States, you did have that. In Brooklyn and in Harlem, New York City in the 1930s, you had communist areas, right? In Brooklyn, there were whole neighborhoods where the Communist Party had a stronghold. In Harlem, the two members of the New York City Council, Peter Coshoni and Benjamin Davis, were members of the Communist Party. In addition to that, you had Vito Marcantonio, the member of the American Labor Party, who was elected to Congress, who was a very close friend of the Communist Party, was in the House of Representatives. In Minneapolis, you had a very close friend of the Communist Party who was elected to Congress, and Minneapolis was very much, it was divided between the Trotskyite communists and the Communist Party USA, but they basically ran Minneapolis. They had the power in that town. San Francisco, the dock workers and Harry Bridges. And if you went around the country, especially Chicago was definitely a communist stronghold. You went around the country, there were areas that the communists controlled, and they were mainly in major cities. And it was among recent immigrants from Eastern Europe and Ireland, Italian Americans, and some of the big sections of the Black community. And it was in major cities throughout the United States, major industrial cities. They had a stronghold. And you could say the same thing about the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party, at one point during the late 60s and up until like the late 70s, there were areas where the Black Panther Party had influence and control. You went to certain places, you went to certain neighborhoods, and the Black Panthers were running the show. And everyone in the neighborhood knew who the Black Panthers were, and the local Black Panther organizers were known by everyone in the neighborhood, and elected officials had to have an alliance or compromise somehow with the Black Panthers. You could say Detroit was like that during the 70s as well. It wasn't the Black Panthers, but it was something called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, and Kenneth Cockrell, and and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and that there was something like this. And it was only in major cities, and in the 70s, it was really only among the Black community, but they had some influence. And if you go even further back, at one point, the Reds ran Oklahoma. You ever hear about the Green Corn Rebellion, right? In Oklahoma, right? The Wobblies, the IWW, they were a very big current among the population. They organized the small farmers. The Socialist Party was very popular. And when World War I happened, in Oklahoma, there was an armed uprising called the Green Corn Rebellion. And, it was supported by the majority. Basically, it was an attempt to say we're not going to be drafted. And if you try to draft us, we're going to shoot you. I mean, it was, these Oklahoma farmers took up guns, and there was kind of an armed uprising that was supported by various layers of the local government in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma in 1910 and 1915 was communist territory. It was that. We don't have anything like that in the United States right now. All right. We just don't have that. I mean, it just doesn't exist. And it will exist eventually. We will get there again as the crisis intensifies. We will return to this state of being. But it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while. And in order to understand why it's going to be a while, you have to understand this point. And the way I'm talking here is it's like in order to understand this, you have to understand this. And in order to understand this, you have to understand this. There's layers to what I'm saying here. So bear with me if this is confusing, but we'll get to the point. But like the closest thing that I ever saw to what a real communist party looks like, I saw when I was living in Cleveland. After college, I was living in Cleveland, living on the east side of Cleveland. And there was an organization called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. And this was an organization. It was not a communist organization by any means. It was a Black nationalist NGO, nonprofit, that its goal was basically to stop gang violence. It was an NGO, but they functioned like this. Every Wednesday night, they had a meeting, and there would be 80, 90, maybe even 100 people that would come to their meeting every Wednesday. And they would talk about the traffic lights and the cost of rent in the neighborhood. They would talk about all kinds of things. And then when there was gang violence, they would negotiate. And when there was police brutality, they would go to court with the victims. They were a center of community power in the Black community. And the leader of it was a guy named Art McCoy, who had a radio program. He was the owner of a barber shop in the neighborhood, and he had a radio program, and he was a Black nationalist, and he convened this Black nationalist organization on the east side of Cleveland that had a lot of influence. It had a lot of influence in Cleveland. Everyone in the Black community knew who he was. He convened these meetings that addressed the needs of the community, and that was the closest thing. If in the 1930s, if you were in a communist area, that's what the Communist Party was. If you were in the 1970s, if you were in an urban Black community, that's what the Black Panthers were. They were this center of community power, and people were going to this organization to get their needs met. People were being educated about politics by this organization, right? The Black Panthers or the Communist Party would teach people communism, teach people Marxism, and lead them in asserting their needs in the community, right? And I mean, Black on Black Crime Incorporated, they were not Marxists, but they would convene hip-hop workshops. They would convene other events where they were teaching people Black nationalism, and they would address and lead the community to assert its needs, right? And interact with elected officials, interact with the police, etc., right? This is how real political power works. This is what real political power looks like. This is what real political power looks like, is you have a geographical area where your political force, whether it's the communists or the nationalists or the socialists or the Islamists or the Christians or whatever they are, whatever it is, if you have a real political movement, that is what it looks like. And, before Bolivarian socialism took power in Venezuela, the communists in Venezuela had this. There were neighborhoods where, as Venezuela was implementing austerity in the 90s, they would lose the electricity, right? The electricity would go off. And so the communists in the neighborhood would organize a strike, and nobody in the neighborhood would go to work until they fixed the power. And then the government would be forced to fix the power. Or when the garbage wasn't being collected, right? When the garbage wasn't being collected, they would be in the neighborhood, and they would start picking. The communists would pick up the garbage, and then they would dump it on a major highway near a rich neighborhood, and that would force the government and the powers that be to say okay, and then they would start collecting the garbage. They would do things like this, where the whole community knew who the local Communist Party organizers were, went to them with their concerns. They're constantly convening community meetings, teaching people Marxism. Classes are going on where they're teaching people their ideology. And at the same time that they're teaching people their ideology, they're also organizing people to assert their needs on a community level, right? That is what communist groups, revolutionary groups that have the potential to take power, that's what they look like, right? Before the Islamic Revolution, the Khomeinists, they played a similar role, right? The Muslim imams, they served that role in the Islamic community, in the neighborhoods in Iran. They were having meetings of the community and teaching them Islam, but also asserting the needs of the community. And many parts of the world where there are revolutionary organizations, that is what they look like. And right now in the United States, we have nothing that looks remotely like that. Nothing, right? We just don't, right? And there's a reason for that, right? And the reason for that is that the ruling class of the United States knows this. They know that when you have what's basically referred to by Vladimir Lenin as what's called dual power, when community assemblies are being formed, when there is some other political force that is pulling levers and pulling the strings of power and has power on the community level, that is how you move towards some kind of revolutionary situation. And they know that that is the case. And so they have worked very, very hard to make sure that that does not happen. And they have worked very, 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 very carefully and very, very sure to make sure it doesn't happen. The groups have been infiltrated. Fred Hampton was killed in his apartment with a hail of bullets. All kinds of efforts have been made. They've set up fake community organizations that are controlled by the Democratic Party. They've done all kinds of things to make sure that no revolutionary organization is able to just set up shop and start functioning in local neighborhoods and operating this way. Right. And most revolutionary groups, most groups in the United States that call themselves Marxists or socialists, they most of them don't even have any aspiration to be this, but some of them do. Some of them do know this is what you're supposed to be, but they are so weak and they are so small and they have such little, influence. They're not even able to pull that off. And so they're just they remain irrelevant. And that's the situation we're in. However, the USA is entering a long-term economic crisis. The U.S. economy has crashed. Living standards are going down. The ruling class are fighting with each other. And as the ruling class fight with one another, they start to recruit workers and working class people to be their foot soldiers in battles with other sections of the ruling class, right? This is Bonapartism. Amid a capitalist crisis, one section of the ruling class seeks to seize control of the government to beat back another section of the ruling class. And you have struggles to take control of the government. One section of the ruling class is fighting another section of the ruling class. And working class people are brought into politics to be the foot soldiers of one section of the ruling class against another. That is how capitalist crises tend to develop, right? And you have fascist groups working for one section, you have leftist or socialist groups working for another section, you have various mobilizations of the population, which they are being used to have the back of one section of the capitalist class against another section of the capitalist class, right? And that's what you have in a time of capitalist crisis. You have a fight within the ruling class. You have the ruling class needing, one section of the ruling class needing to assert power over another. And you have then the population being drawn into politics as a way for the ruling class to fight amongst themselves. And that is what gives birth to different kinds of movements. And so the ruling class of the United States is gradually coming to terms with the fact that they can't function in the old way. The old American way of doing things from the time of the Cold War up into today is that most Americans are politically not involved. They don't think about politics, economics, or whatever. They're thinking about football and baseball and bowling. They're thinking about, celebrity gossip, and they're thinking about how they're going to, remodel their kitchen or what their daughter's wedding is going to look like. And that the way the ruling class of the United States has ruled since the 1950s has been to keep people out of politics. The idea has been that average Americans are comfortable enough that they have enough of a decent living standard that we can assume that, yes, every 4 years they will vote for the president. They'll vote for the Democrat or a Republican to be president. But for the most part, most average Americans are not involved in politics. They're just living their lives. They're just focused on their own personal stuff. They're focused on, short term, figuring out how they can live, or they're being entertained by the television, or they're, for the most part, they're tuned out of politics. That is the way the ruling class of the United States has been operating since the beginning of the Cold War. And it worked for a long time because the USA had a very strong economy, and politics wasn't confronting people. People didn't have to worry about politics. People were able to get a decent job, and that, yes, certain sections of the population, like the Black community, were highly politicized. You had a layer of intellectuals and college students who were politicized. You did have the Vietnam War, where young men were being drafted and didn't want to go, and so then they were confronted with politics. But for the most part, the way the United States was held together was that average Americans, Black, white, Arab, Asian, Latino, were not thinking about politics. They were just kind of chilling out and enjoying a high standard of living. And the ruling class was able to stay in power. And there was a kind of consensus among the ruling class. Ronald Reagan said, we're all friends after 6 o'clock, meaning that at the end of the day, there wasn't that much of a difference between the Democrats and Republicans. They might fight with each other in the short term, but they had kind of a gentlemanly agreement that we're all on the same page here against the communists and against the Russians and the Chinese or whatever. And that was how American politics operated. But then you'll recall that there has been an economic crisis, and living standards in the United States are drastically decreasing. And the country's roads are falling apart. They're unpaving the roads in 27 different states right now. They are pulling up the asphalt and pulverizing it and replacing paved roads with dirt roads. And there's a huge opioid epidemic, and people are dying en masse. And there is a dropping standard of living. There's a rise in dissident ideas among the population. People are interested in conspiracy theories. People are interested in the history of protest movements. People are conspiracy opposing the government, thinking that the government is run by some secret shady group. The population isn't happy. The neighborhoods of the suburbs are full of empty, foreclosed homes. The next generation is gripped by debt. Living standards are going down. The population is angry, so they can't afford to do that anymore. They can't. Average Americans are like, something's wrong, and we want to do something about it. And so the ruling class is trying to manage that, and they are fighting among each other. There's a big divide in the ruling class between the centers of power, Silicon Valley, and the big four super major oil companies and the intelligence agencies versus the military industrial complex and Betsy DeVos and lower level capitalists. There's kind of a push and pull. There's a power struggle among the American elite, and they're fighting with each other. And average Americans are furious that things just keep getting worse, and they want action to be taken. And there's a moment where they need to on the one hand, they need to settle scores among themselves. And on the other hand, they need to get the masses who want change and are going to increasingly get involved in different movements to try and bring about that change. They need to be led. Someone needs to point them toward doing something. So what we have seen over the course of the last couple decades, what we have seen is an attempt to stave off an actual movement from developing. It has been an attempt to kind of mimic movements in the hopes of keeping Americans out of politics. The Bernie Sanders campaign was a great example of that. We had a socialist who was running for president who was saying left-wing populist things. All kinds of people around the country, there was like an upsurge of support for Bernie Sanders because people around the country were mad at income inequality and the deteriorating of the country, student debt, healthcare costs, etc. Good question. And wrote it down and keep the super chats rolling in, right? That's what our second half of the show is about. And there was an upsurge of support for Bernie Sanders. And Donald Trump got elected in 2016. And, there was an upsurge of support for him. And, he had like the March for Trump, and he was kind of building a layer of support among the population, building up kind of right-wing movements to support him. And there was like elements of having some kind of movement, but it was really not a movement. It was just get our guy in office, get him elected. And once he's elected, things will change. And of course, Trump got into office, things didn't change. The elections were rigged against Bernie Sanders. And then he told his followers to just accept whatever and vote for Hillary Clinton. And neither of those things were real. However, there have been some anti-establishment movements that have emerged from beneath the surface. And honestly, at this point, most of them have been right-wing. But they have existed. Among the far right-wing, groups of people that are heavily armed, groups of people that are at odds with the U.S. power structure, there have been some developments of, forces that have ideas that are at odds with what American imperialism wants. And we have watched the ruling class manage these developments. First example, right? The alt-right, right? If you're a regular leftist, you just say, well, the alt-right was a conspiracy by the capitalists. No, it wasn't. The alt-right, as awful as it was a movement. It was on the internet, and it was young men that have resentment, that don't like the identity politics, that don't like the woke makeover of the United States. It was young men mainly exploring far-right fascistic ideas, white nationalism, fascism, various, it was, libertarian, free market economics, racial pseudoscience. There was kind of a spontaneous upsurge of young white men who were feeling alienated from U.S. society. Because they were feeling alienated from U.S. society, they became interested in ideas that are forbidden by the U.S. political establishment and are at odds with the interests of American imperialism, right? A lot of them were thinking things like Russia's the great white homeland, and they know nothing about Russia's international relationships and how close Russia is with African countries and whatever, or that they think China is somehow fascist. It's just fascism. It's National Socialism for the Han Chinese. They're wrong, okay? They don't know what they're talking about. But, they're coming out of a right-wing background. They're operating on the assumption that communism is pure evil. They're operating on the assumption, on the basis of having resentment against people of color, against women, against LGBT folks, etc. Talk about chapter 3, not 4. They're having some resentment, about the woke makeover that U.S. society is having. So you have these young white men that were interested in fascist ideas. Well, there have been fascist groups in the United States for many years. The American Nazi Party, the National Socialist Movement, the, what is it called? The National Alliance, National Vanguard, the Council of Conservative Citizens. White supremacist fascist organizations have existed in the United States for a very long time. But those groups have always been fringe and irrelevant. However, in response to this kind of upsurge of young white men who were getting interested in fascistic ideas, and often that led them to be so at odds with the American political establishment, they would do things like praise North Korea or whatever. In order to manage it, something came into existence called the alt-right. And the alt-right was not the American Nazi Party. It was not the National Socialist Movement. It was not the National Vanguard or whatever. The alt-right was made for social media. Richard Spencer, Augustus Sol Invictus, these were internet entertainers who espoused an alt-right-ish message. But it was not very politically coherent. You know, if you listen to the American Nazi Party, you listen to those folks, they know what they're all about. They are racist. They deny the Holocaust. They have a certain worldview. They want this. They have a very coherent message. These guys didn't. Richard Spencer would get up there and his I'm an edgelord voice. Yes, I am proud to be white. Yes, doesn't it offend you? I don't know that the Holocaust happened. How do you know? I mean, he talks like this. I mean, you listen to Richard Spencer talk, he actually talks in this like, wow, are you offended by my existence? Yes. I mean, he actually sounds like that, right? Richard Spencer is a very, very wealthy young guy that they found to be the rodeo clown, to be the internet, internet entertainment, to kind of corral and lead these young white men who had these anti-establishment ideas, and he was just this he's from a very, very wealthy family, and he's one guy, and they would dress him up in fancy clothes, and they had high quality, very expensive videos. And he got on there and he said, what? And he gave this kind of vague, very incoherent white nationalist message. And then, various people liked him. And then they had Augustus Invictus. And I debated Augustus Invictus. And he was another one of these. Now, unlike Richard Spencer, who talked like this, I debated Augustus Invictus, right? And I mean, he was just as incoherent, right? It was like this goth thing, and he sacrificed a goat, and he went off into nature, and I shall come. I mean, you watch my debate with Augustus Invictus. What the hell does he stand for? Nobody knows. He stands for like weird pagan traditional religion and anti-communism. And I mean, it's incoherent. Augustus Invictus is completely incoherent. But he was one of these rodeo clowns whose social media exploded, right? And he, had all these elaborate, complicated interviews with Vice, and they were building him up. And he put out this kind of incoherent message that was racist and fascist and pagan and supremacist and whatever, right? And, instead of building organizations, they didn't build organizations, the alt-right, right? It wasn't like the American Nazi Party just started recruiting. Oh, no. Wasn't that. It wasn't that, the national vanguards or what. No. They found these various clowns, usually very, very wealthy kids who didn't want to have to have a real job, and were probably very well connected. There were probably people within the government apparatus that, that knew relatives of theirs, family members, and said, all right, this is the guy for the job. And they put them up there as they were the representatives of white nationalism, right? And they were up there, and they were the various clowns. And instead of organizing some kind of alt-right movement, they organized people on the internet to watch these clowns and listen to these clowns put forward a very incoherent, kind of fascist, kind of, definitely racist, definitely offensive, but not really ideological message with their various clowns. And these clowns performed, and the liberals were outraged about how horrible these clowns were. And these clowns were revving up people in the Trump movement. And if you were in the Trump movement, you'd eventually, hear about one of these clowns. But then after Trump got elected president, they had Charlottesville, right? And they did the Charlottesville thing. And all of these clowns assembled in one place, and they got all the leftists to assemble in one place. And, a guy was driving his car around. There was violence. We all know what happened at Charlottesville. A police helicopter crashed. Some guy was driving his car into people. And they had an episode of violence. And that was the end of the alt-right. And that's really, the alt-right is done. It's done. I mean, it's over. right? All the clowns of the alt-right are all crippled. They've got debt. They've been sued out the ass. They're going to be paying lawsuit settlements for the rest of their lives. The political organizations of the alt-right have been broken up by the government, and that was the end of the alt-right. The alt-right was there as a mechanism for making sure a real movement of far-rightists didn't emerge. That's what it was there to do. It was there to make sure that in light of all the political problems and anger and in light of the upsurge of fascistic and white supremacist ideas among a certain section of the population, it was there to basically manage it and then lead it off a cliff. And it did. And it led them off a cliff. And now Richard Spencer is just some guy on the internet who's got like Twitter spaces where he talks about different things. And, he wanted me to debate him at one point, and I didn't. I wasn't interested. And he's nobody now, right? And Augustus Invictus, what is he doing? No one knows what he's doing, right? I mean, and there's other names I could mention. They've just kind of vanished into obscurity. The whole thing just kind of spiraled downward into nothing. And the reason that it spiraled downward into nothing, I will add, again, not endorsing anything about what these people are about, but I'm just explaining what happened, is because the whole thing was a shortcut. The whole thing was a shortcut. It was there to tell adherents of the far right, you don't have to build a real movement. You don't have to build an organization that has roots in communities. You don't have to actually set up political infrastructure. All you need to do is listen to these clowns. Listen to these clowns perform. Go and watch this clown show. And eventually, it'll influence debate, blah, 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 blah. And so a lot of these young men that were bought into these alt-right ideas, they followed their favorite clown. They followed Spencer or Invictus or one of them. And they followed them to Charlottesville. People got hurt. People got sued. And that was the end of that. The shortcut proved to not be a shortcut. For the alt-right, the shortcut was actually a path off a cliff. And the danger that was posed to the establishment of all these young men developing anti-establishment racist ideas, it was abetted. Right? They had various entertainers who entertained them, led them to a place to become very, very hated and humiliated and disabled, politically disabled. And now the alt-right is gone and it's scattered. I mean, there's people that used to be part of the alt-right that are converting to Russian Orthodoxy. There's a traditional Catholicism thing that's very popular. There's people that used to be part of the alt-right that are just, they're doing there's, what's his name? The kid who used to be part of the alt-right is now a bread tuber. Faraday speaks. But it was a clever diversion. A clever diversion to take a strange anti-establishment current and lead it to a place where it would do no harm. And now it has this anti-establishment current has been broken up. And now they've got Jordan Peterson. They've done lots of research into what made a young person join the alt-right, the resentment against feminism, the longing for some kind of father figure, etc. So then they found Jordan Peterson. And now Jordan Peterson's up there and he's the gentle father figure who loves them, and they ask him about incels and he cries, oh, these young men, and it's they got Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is just espousing your typical anti-communism mixed in with like self-help advice. And so now all the young men who have this kind of resentment, all those young men, now they go and they follow Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson leads them to be conservative, be Republican, and they're not a threat to the status quo. And alt-right is done. right? And the reason that alt-right is done is because rather than sink its roots into the community, which is what fascist groups tend to do around the world, just like communist groups, fascist groups also tend to sink their roots into communities. You go to Greece, the Golden Dawn is a fascist group. It sunk its roots into the community. Well, you know, the alt-right, it got diverted away from sinking its roots into the community. It got diverted away from building actual organizations, actual far-right fascist parties, and it dissolved into nothing. January 6th is a similar kind of development. You had President Donald Trump, and he was president, and for the most part, he governed kind of standard, lowered taxes on the rich, but there were a couple moments where he did things that the US establishment didn't like, and there were a lot of average Americans that liked the idea. Here's a guy who's the president of the United States, and he calls CNN fake news, and he talks about the military-industrial complex. And there was a kind of, among Americans that are alienated by the political process, there was a weird identification with Trump. And I as someone who went to Trump rallies, someone who's, I actually interacted with Donald Trump, and I mean, it's you start to identify with him, right? Because they're smearing him every day and they're attacking him on a personal level and they're going after him. And you hate the American media, you hate the American elite, and they're attacking Donald Trump. And he's up there and he's like, yeah, and he's tweeting you couldn't help but sympathize with Trump. If you were some kind of anti-establishment person, as awful as Trump was, you couldn't help but on some level identify with him. If you're at odds with the American establishment and you see him fighting the American establishment, on some level, you kind of identified with him and a lot of Americans did. A lot of them were sympathizing with Trump, thinking Trump is fighting the elites. Trump is fighting the establishment, they identified with him. And so Donald Trump was president. The pandemic happened. He on and off was fighting with the neoconservatives. He did the North Korea thing. And then John Bolton, tried to wreck the North Korea thing. And then ultimately John Bolton, one of the main neoconservatives, got booted out of Trump's administration. And after that, Trump was doing different things and one thing led to another. And we come around to the 2020 election. And Donald Trump lost. And a lot of Trump's followers believed it was rigged. They believed it was rigged against Donald Trump. And so January 6th happened. Now, we don't know exactly what caused January 6th to happen the way it did. We don't know, right? We do know that Donald Trump said to his supporters, "I'll meet you at the Capitol." So it looks like he was anticipating some of his supporters going into the Capitol. But then we also know that there were FBI informants and, there's questions about, regardless, we saw what happened on January 6th, which is a bunch of Donald Trump supporters got into the U.S. Capitol, made utter fools of themselves. And then just like Charlottesville, the government jumped on top of that. And, they've been talking about January 6th as if it is the most important event in the history of the United States. And they've jumped on top of it. Trump was banned from all social media outlets. And they did a really, really good, right? They did a really, really good job of basically breaking up Donald Trump's movement, breaking Trump away from a lot of his supporters in the Republican Party and the establishment, sending the FBI to crush various groups, locking up and jailing a lot of Trump supporters. They did a very, very good job with January 6th of, Donald Trump and his movement is significantly weakened. Now, some people think they could come back, and I think there's a chance that they could come back. But Donald Trump is also pretty old, and, it looks like they did a really, really good job of weakening. Again, it was a shortcut. Donald Trump's supporters They didn't dig their roots into the community. Donald Trump did not engage in activities that would dramatically improve the lives of average Americans. He did not, he did not take dramatic action to fix the lives of average Americans. They didn't build a movement that had support in every neighborhood where you had a Trump community assembly that was organized. They didn't do that. It wasn't a real movement. It was Donald Trump was a clown that they've had on primetime television for years. He got elected president. And from the White House, he gave incoherent messages. I am totally in support of Israel. It's really awesome, man. And like, they want a 2-state solution. They want a 1-state solution. They're going to get everything they want, man. They're going to get everything they want. I am the president of the United States. It's going to be amazing. I mean, it was just incoherent gibberish. I mean, it was like, what did he stand for? What did he believe? I am the leader of the silent majority. It is so amazing. I mean, it was incoherent. He gave an incoherent, non-ideological message. Right? People said Donald Trump was a fascist. No, he wasn't. Fascism is a very clear, ideologically coherent message. It's not a good one, but Donald Trump wasn't doing that. He was all over the place, just like those people in the alt-right, just like Augustus Invictus, just like Richard Spencer, it was this incoherent message, but kind of against the establishment. It was a presidency that didn't really fight the status quo in the United States. It said things that people didn't like. There were times where there were push and pull, and he was pushing back and fighting with different factions. For the most part, nothing really changed as a result of Donald Trump being president. Nothing. And then, to top it all off, his supporters got led off of a cliff. They had their Charlottesville. They had January 6th, where after a long incoherent movement, after people not really being taught like an ideology or a belief system, and after not really sinking their roots in there, but just putting on a lengthy clown show, they all got let off of a cliff. Right? Donald Trump was a shortcut. Right? And this is how the ruling class of the United States is managing dissident ideas. I mean, you can say the same thing about Bernie Sanders. Right? Bernie Sanders, he got up there and he virtue signaled anti-capitalism. He got up there, I want corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. But he wasn't really preaching Marxism. He wasn't really preaching an ideological class struggle message. He wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't a social democrat even, right? He wasn't calling for the workers to control the means of production. He was just saying, I will make corporations pay their fair share of taxes. I think that healthcare is a right, but he wasn't actually preaching an ideology. And the followers of Bernie Sanders were not being mobilized to build a real organization. DSA is not a real organization. It does not have roots in the community. DSA is a campaign for the Democrats club, right? And they're not really teaching an ideology. Oh, worker co-ops are good. Yeah, and Republicans are racist, man. And I mean, they, incoherent messaging, not ideology. You can't, they do not want an ideology to be espoused, and they do not want an organization that sinks its roots into the community. What they want is a kind of incoherent voice that gives voice to the resentments of certain sections of the population. And then leads its followers off of a cliff. And in Bernie's campaign, it led them to vote for Hillary Clinton. It led them to the Democratic National Convention. When they got to the Democratic National Convention, they lost. It was rigged against them, and Bernie Sanders said to vote for Hillary Clinton. And this is the game that the ruling class is playing with dissident movements. And there's people that are probably upset that I'm talking about the alt-right and all of that. Well, I'm sorry. The alt-right, with its, sympathy for anti-imperialist states and its rejection of the woke makeover that U.S. imperialism desperately needs if it's going to claim moral high ground against Russia and China. And, the alt-right, as bad as it was an upsurge of ideas that are out of line with the American mainstream, as wrong as they are, okay? So if it makes you mad that I'm using them as an example, you can just say that. But this is how they are managing dissident movements right now, is they come up with a dog and pony show, an incoherent, non-ideological dog and pony show. They mobilize people around this incoherent, lack of ideology dog and pony show. They mobilize people around it. And then this dog and pony show leads them off a cliff. And then everyone walks away from the movement demoralized. And that's what they did with Bernie. That's what Trump's supporters did. That's what the alt-right did. And this is how they manage dissident sections of the population right now. And the way they do it is with shortcuts. It's all a shortcut. And look, BreadTube. Right now, BreadTube was part of the Bernie Sanders campaign. Ultimately, BreadTube emerged, ContraPoints, all of them emerged. It was part of the Bernie Sanders upsurge, but they're clowns. They're clowns. If there ever was clowns, they are clowns. Their message is incoherent. They like worker cooperatives. There's some secret Nazi conspiracy that's taken over the government. And Russia and China and Venezuela and anyone who supports them is somehow secretly a Nazi and part of the alt-right. And it's an incoherent message. And they're doing damage control, and they're kind of picking up the pieces from what was left behind of the Bernie campaign. But, and Peter is absolutely right about this, but this is how they are managing dissent in the United States right now. Because ultimately, the only thing that can really change is the construction of some kind of real movement. That is the only thing that will ultimately result in political changes in the United States. And that may be hard for people to understand. But unless you have what the Black Panthers had, which is geography, unless you have territory that you control, neighborhoods, unless you have what the Communist Party had, unless you have what far-right movements around the world and in the United States historically have had, unless you have a real movement, a group with a base in neighborhoods, a group that local politicians have to negotiate, a group that is teaching people an ideology, not an incoherent expression of their grievances, but an actual ideology. Unless you have that, you really don't have the power to change U.S. society. And historically, communism and fascism have emerged during times of political crisis, times of political turmoil, as real ideological movements with roots in the community that different sections of the ruling class have to negotiate. And if it gets to the point that liberalism collapses into fascist illiberalism, they become, they create a totalitarian fascist state. Or if the communists are able to maneuver and eventually they are able to overturn capitalist property relations. But all of these things come from real movements. And the ruling class of the United States is conscious enough to realize that any real movement is a serious threat to the status quo. That if the USA were to go to fascism, some sections of the capitalist class would do very well, but a lot of capitalists in the United States would be crushed. Right? A lot of the ruling class would be crushed in order to make way for a full-on fascist state. Meanwhile, if there were to be a socialist revolution in the United States and we had, a working class revolutionary government, that would spell the end of capitalist power in the United States. And capitalism as it exists in the United States would be subordinated to the overall socialist state based in the working class and their organizations. And that any kind of real movement that has roots in the community, that is teaching people a real ideology, that has power on a local level and controls geography, any such movement would ultimately, be a threat to the power of a lot, if not all, in the case of communists, all capitalists. And in the case of fascists, like 50% of capitalists, right? And that's the situation. And so there is an effort to make sure that we don't develop a real actual movement. There's an effort to make sure that a real actual movement of any kind doesn't emerge And instead, we get rodeo clowns that eventually lead us off a cliff. And that's what's going on. And we need to keep this in mind. We need to keep this in mind because there were a lot of leftists, I even fell into some of this thinking, who thought the Bernie Sanders movement was an opportunity to get rich. They thought it was an opportunity to win the jackpot, to win the lottery. And it wasn't. And there were probably all kinds of people that thought that the Trump movement or that thought that the alt-right was their opportunity to make a lot of money, to win the jackpot. And it wasn't. Right? And it wasn't, right? And that here's what you need to understand. The Russian Revolution was kind of an accident. Let me emphasize that. The Russian Revolution was kind of an accident. Wasn't supposed to happen. The Tsar was fighting World War I. The Russian state had one foot in feudalism and was also trying to be a modern capitalist country, and there was this push and pull going on. And the Tsar was fighting World War I, and Europe was laughing at the Tsar because of the whole Rasputin scandal. And so the ruling class of Russia wanted to bring down the Tsar, and so they did. And then the ruling class of Russia was divided over should they continue fighting in World War I or shouldn't they? And German intelligence, they had this plan to fund revolutionaries to get Russia out of the war. And so Lenin went back to Russia with a lot of money from German intelligence and a lot of support from sections of the Russian capitalist class who didn't want to fight in World War I. And then the provisional government was facing being overthrown by the Kornilov reaction. And one thing led to another, and there was a lot of chaos. And amid the chaos, there was a historical accident where the Bolshevik Party was able to take power. And the Russian Revolution should not be studied as a model of how communists come to power because it was an accident. And it happened amid a moment of confusion where the ruling class of the world and the ruling class of Russia largely dropped the ball. They were asleep at the wheel, and there was so much crisis, and a huge world war was going on, and millions of people were dying, and the capitalist imperialist countries were fighting among each other. And amid a huge clusterfuck of confusion, a real movement called the Bolsheviks that had existed but had been marginal was able to maneuver through the chaos and take power. And there was widespread panic among the ruling classes of the world after the Russian Revolution. J. Edgar Hoover was giving lectures to Congress all about how, oh my God, the Bolshevik menace. And because nobody saw it coming. People didn't even know who Lenin was. There's articles. I looked at old newspapers when the Russian Revolution happened. The New York Times articles, they thought Trotsky had led the Russian Revolution because he was this guy who lived in New York City who was a Russian communist that everybody knew. People didn't know who Lenin was. For a while, they didn't even get Lenin's name right. Did you know that? It was Vladimir Lenin. And there was another Bolshevik leader named Nikolai Bukharin. And for a long time, American newspapers were referring to Nikolai Lenin. There is no person, Nikolai Lenin. There's Vladimir Lenin and Nikolai Bukharin. But for a long time, American newspapers were like, oh my God, this guy we've never heard of, Nikolai Lenin, has taken power. What is going on here? Like, they had no idea. The Russian Revolution was an accident. It was a big, big accident on the part of the ruling classes of the world. And one of the mistakes that revolutionaries around the world fall into is they think it's going to happen like that. And it's not. Right? The Russian Revolution was unique historical circumstances. It was a society that was caught between Western capitalism and ancient feudalism and confused. There was a big world war going on, so everyone was distracted, and one thing led to another, and the Bolsheviks aligned here, and they aligned there, and they maneuvered, and they were able to take power. That's what happened. And it was a historical accident. It was an accident. And the ruling classes of the world have been very careful to make sure nothing like that ever happens again. However, the Chinese Revolution was not an accident. The Chinese Revolution is a much, much more accurate model for what is probably going to happen. Right? How did the Chinese Revolution happen? Well, The Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution happened. The Soviet Union was created. And at the time, there was a huge nationalist movement in China called the KMT, the Kuomintang Nationalist Movement. And it was a movement of Chinese capitalists who wanted to become wealthy and didn't want to be kicked around by the Japanese capitalists, the British, and the American capitalists anymore. And so there was this widespread nationalist movement in China, the KMT. Leader of it was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And because the KMT wanted, Chinese workers and peasants to support them, their message had a social democratic or socialistic edge to it. The KMT movement, they believed in, it was independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. And it was paid for by the wealthiest Chinese people who were fighting against the Japanese, fighting against the Americans and the British. They wanted control of their country. And so after the Russian Revolution, there was a few different Chinese people that were sympathizers with the Bolshevik Revolution, believed in communism. And so they were advised by Stalin and others to join Dr. Sun Yat-sen's movement and join the KMT movement. And the Soviet Union was a country. And the Soviet Union provided military and financial aid to the new Chinese government and the KMT movement. And the Communist Party was aligned with the Soviet Union. So that created a moment where there was kind of an obligation on the part of the KMT movement to tolerate the Communist Party, to let them exist. And so the Communist Party started to flourish as a wing of the KMT movement. They joined the KMT movement. They were entryists into the KMT movement. The Soviet Union was financially supporting China. So there was room within the KMT movement for the communists to grow. And so the communists flourished as this very radical wing of the KMT movement. And then, after the communists expanded their influence and grew more popular, Dr. Sun Yat-sen died, Chiang Kai-shek came into power, and somehow Chiang Kai-shek was convinced that the communists were out to get him. He was convinced the communists were no good. So Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the KMT movement, killed hundreds of thousands of communists, and he ordered the rounding up and executing of all the communist leaders. And this was a huge step back for the Chinese Communist Party. They had controlled whole cities. They'd had representatives. They were a real movement, right? They were a real movement, but they were basically their ally, the KMT, which had been their big ally, suddenly turned on them and started killing them in mass. And so the communists, they lost hundreds of thousands of people and they had to flee into the countryside. And so the communists were in the countryside and they completely changed their tactic. And there were uprisings going on among the peasantry, among poor rural folks. Peasants were rising up against their landlords. And so the communists went and they joined the peasant movement. There was this peasant movement that was happening. So the communists joined it. And the peasants, they would fight their landlords and kill them with guns. And so the communists organized an army, the Red Army, that would be like an army that would participate in this peasant movement. And they organized armed uprisings and they seized liberated territory. In 1931, they declared the Chinese Soviet Republic. And they had a chunk of the country that was, communist controlled. And then Chiang Kai-shek, with the backing of Germany and the United States and other countries, sent his military in there and crushed the Chinese Soviet Republic. And so again, they were forced to retreat up into the mountains. And this whole chunk of territory that they'd had, they lost. And they were retreated up into the mountains. And then there were people in the Chinese Communist Party who blamed Mao for the defeat. There was an uprising against Mao within the party. They said, well, it's Mao's fault that we had this setback. And so there was a fight in the party, and the communists killed other communists in this fight. But then they did the Long March. A couple years later, they were seizing liberated territory again. They were suddenly back. People thought they'd been eliminated. People thought the communists were gone, and they were back. And then Japan invaded China. And so the KMT party that had been killing the communists was forced to enter an alliance with the communists against Japan. So the Chinese communists fought against Japan. for all of World War II, from 1937 to 1945, they teamed up with the very people who'd been killing them to fight the Japanese. And then, after World War II, they wanted to form a coalition government. And the KMT wouldn't allow it. Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't allow it. And he started trying to disarm and disarm their army. So they had another civil war. And the civil war kept going. And then, this is important history here, Chiang Kai-shek had this great idea. He was going to confiscate the gold of all the rich Chinese people and give them a new Western paper currency. You know, in America, they don't carry gold around. They've got dollar bills. And, you know, so Chiang Kai-shek went to all the rich people in the areas he controlled, and he gave them paper currency for their gold. And he confiscated all their gold, and he gave them paper currency. And then his currency crashed. And Chiang Kai-shek, all the rich people that were aligned with Chiang Kai-shek lost all of their money. And at that point, some of them started saying, shit, this Chiang Kai-shek guy is completely incompetent. You know, the communists are bad, but, you know, we might still have our money if they were in charge. And Mao started meeting with some of these wealthy capitalists. And before the Red Army would seize an area, Mao would go to the area and he would meet with the local rich people. And he would say to them, you know, this communism stuff, I don't believe that. I'm just getting money from the Soviet Union. I don't believe in communism. Don't worry. After we come to power, you'll keep your millions of dollars. You'll keep your land. Trust me, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And they believed him. And it was due to Chiang Kai-shek's currency crash, and it was due to the Chinese communists winning over various capitalists to understand that they were not a threat, that ultimately, in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party was able to declare the People's Republic. They were able to drive the KMT out of the Chinese mainland. The KMT fled to Taiwan. And Mao kept his word. In the 1950s, there were still millionaires in China who didn't have their property touched, right? I mean, for the first 10 years of the People's Republic of China, there were a lot of wealthy capitalists who were aligned with the Chinese Communist Party who never had their property nationalized and all of that. And it wasn't until the 60s that China started moving to actually create a fully socialist economy. But for the first decade or so, it was the Communist Party was in charge, but the government very much, they built infrastructure with aid from the Soviet Union. They had the Barefoot Doctors campaign and bringing people medical care, etc. But for the first decade or so, you know, they didn't mess with the capitalists of China, right? And that this is what you have to understand. The Chinese Revolution was not an accident. It wasn't the Bolshevik Revolution. It wasn't like there was a bunch of chaos going on, and then this one group that no one had ever heard of got money from the Germans and maneuvered here and maneuvered here, and they came to power. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was an accident. And that's not to denigrate the fact that Lenin was clearly a brilliant leader because he was able to maneuver within all of that. And the moment where they were asleep at the wheel, he was able to take power. I mean, you can admire the fact that they made the most of it. But in a lot of ways, the Bolshevik Revolution was an accident. The Chinese Revolution was not an accident. It was a long, long, long march of a group, an organization, a movement, gradually building itself up. That's what the Chinese Revolution was. It was the communists were an obscure sect. Then they joined the KMT. Then they were fighting in the countryside. Then they were aligning and fighting Japan. Then they were, and it was a series of negotiations and compromises the whole time, building up community power. And that's what they were doing the whole time. They were seizing geography. They were having areas that they controlled. And they were building up community power and building a real movement. And there were working class people, peasants, that they were teaching their ideology to, and they were serving them on a local level. And dual power structures were created, and gradually, this alternative government, this communist party, this communist movement that had real roots among the population, was teaching a very clear ideology, gradually over the course of decade after decade after decade, and strategic alliance here and strategic alliance there, gradually, step by step, was getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and maneuvering here and maneuvering there and maneuvering here and making a compromise here. And finally, after all of that, you got the People's Republic of China that was created. And even then, for the first 10 years, the People's Republic of China, they tolerated a lot of capitalism. They were the government, but in order to stay in power, they had to keep a lot of the powerful people that had been under the old regime. They had to let them stay. They let those millionaires keep their millions. They didn't touch certain capitalist property. I mean, even for the first 10 years they're in power, they didn't even fight a lot of the capitalists because they didn't want to have another civil war, right? So this is what you have to understand, is that a real movement that can actually take power sinks roots in the community, and there are any shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. And this may sound incoherent, but I'm trying to get you to understand, because this applies to us. What we are doing is not what BreadTube is doing. We are not trying to just be rodeo clowns and entertainers. We are not trying to put on a show and lead you off a cliff. We're trying to build a real organization. That's what we aim to do. The Center for Political Innovation is a real organization educating people about socialism, educating people about Marxism, bringing people together to have community with each other, to be part of a community, to know each other, to build a network of people who believe in anti-imperialism. And that is the kind of thing that could lead to a real movement someday. That could lead to there being geography, there being areas where there are regions that are anti-imperialist and communist. This is the kind of thing that could actually lead to some kind of real movement happening. However, in order for us to do this, and thank you. In order for us to do this, we have to understand that this is a long march. And we have to understand that there are no shortcuts. And if we get caught up in shortcuts, we will get led off of the cliff. That's what will happen. If we become a shortcut, we will get led off of a cliff. There is no shortcut. It's difficult. It's hard. And we will remain fringe. We should be prepared. We shouldn't expect huge surges in membership. That would be great. That would be great. We shouldn't expect huge surges in membership. We shouldn't expect that overnight we recruit millions and millions of people. And we should expect to make alliances. And we should expect to be an entity that persists to exist. That is the main thing. That we are there. That's the point. The point is that we are there. And that we continue to be there. And we continue to be there. Doing anti-imperialist things, putting on anti-imperialist conferences, teaching our anti-imperialist classes. And we bring people into our community here, and we bring people into our community there, and we bring people into our community here, and we bring people into our community there, and that we're just there. And that people know that we're there. And we're not going to blow up the way their rodeo clowns blow up. And we're not going to explode in popularity. But we're also not going to get led off of a cliff. We're going to just continue to exist. Just continue to do our thing, and just continue to be marginalized, and just continue to be hated, and just continue to be canceled. I'm going to be canceled over and over and over again. They're going to cancel me 100 times. They're going to cancel me 100 times. And eventually they're going to stop canceling me because they're going to realize that I just keep doing stuff. I just keep existing. No matter how many times you send out the memo that I'm Satan and that I eat babies, I'm just going to keep doing stuff. And we are going to exist on the margins of U.S. society, gradually building up our community, gradually winning people over, gradually expanding our membership, gradually winning people over, gradually getting our ideology out there, gradually winning people over, until it will get to a point that we have enough resources that there's going to be areas where our ideas are so pervasive that local politicians kind of have to pander to them in order to get elected. There's going to come times where people just can't ignore us any longer. And then there will probably come a crisis where the ruling class realizes that the only way they can settle the scores among themselves is if there is some kind of real movement that supports them. And we will be that real movement. And we will have that territory, and we will have that ideology, and we will have that core of dedicated people. And that will be our moment. But we need to come to terms with this reality. We are going to get canceled over and over again, and we're going to keep going. We're going to get canceled over and over and over again, and we're going to keep going. And we are going to exist, and they're going to pretend that we're not there, but we're going to keep being there. And we're going to keep building up our forces, and we're going to keep maneuvering, and we're going to keep bringing people in, and we are going to lay the foundations, not of a clown show, but of a real movement. And this is what you need to understand. And it's not easy, but it's really the only way that you can actually win. You have to do this. You have to do the hard work of building a real community of solidarity, a real movement. You have to teach a real coherent ideology. You have to give people something to be part of. You have to build a real community. A lot of people say we seem a lot like a church. Well, I agree. Churches are a great model of community power. Right? You think there's a politician in an area and all local pastors are against him? You think he's going to win? No. Right? Churches are organizations that serve communities, that teach people an ideology, and wield a lot of power and influence because of it. The church is a great model to study. Right? I think the more we look like a church, the more we provide people what churches used to provide them: community, a place to belong, an ideology, something to believe in. The more that we do that, the better shape we are in. So yeah, instead of setting up a whiz-bang social media clown show that leads you off a cliff, instead of being, putting on some internet show where I talk like this, and then you go to Charlottesville, and then that's the end of it. Instead of, putting on some kind of bread tube, incoherent Republicans or Nazis clown show that gets you to vote for Bernie and then, dissolve into pessimism, we are just going to keep plugging away. We are going to build our community because this is a way that we can actually win. This is an actual serious strategy for building a movement, because what ultimately will lead to socialism coming to the United States is going to be a real movement. And building a real movement is very difficult, and it is not easy. And it is a very, very long, painful process. And there's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts. And there's no magic. There's no winning the lottery. yes, there are moments where all of a sudden things come crashing through. There are moments where all the hard work that you've done suddenly manifests itself. Yes, those things happen. However, there's a lot of careful building up. One of the main things we're doing in the Center for Political Innovation right now is we're training people to be teachers. We're training people how to use this book to convene classes in their neighborhoods. We're training people how to give the Saxton lectures so that they can give the lectures. We're training people how to learn the important concepts that you'll notice the fake socialists never talk about, like the tendency of the rate of profit to fall or overproduction. We're training people how to explain Bolshevism and Party of New Type, and how to explain imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, how to explain why China is a socialist country despite having a market sector and a lot of income inequality, right? This is what we're doing. It's not easy, but we are training people to be organizers, training people to be teachers. And thank you, Jason, for the super chat. I do appreciate it. This is not easy work, and we should expect that we won't see the payoff very soon. And we should expect that there will come along various shortcuts, and we'll be frustrated that we don't have the success that those taking those shortcuts have. But we then shouldn't be surprised to watch those shortcuts lead off a cliff, like the Bernie Sanders campaign, or like Charlottesville, or like January 6th, because shortcuts don't lead where you're going. They're not really shortcuts. They are diversions. They are maneuvers by the establishment to control dissent. But ultimately, it is real movements, real, actual movements that lead to real change. And that is what we are trying to create. And that it's not easy. It's not easy. But we're going to do it. And the fact that I'm on here every night streaming, and you all are on here every night listening to me, the fact that we are planning a conference in March, the fact that we have different operations we can engage in and different allies we can strategically align ourselves with, the fact that we are the only socialist current that has not either dissolved into wokeness or kept its ideology dead in the 20th century, but we have a 21st century understanding. We're the only people that are putting forward, exactly, Ryan. We're the only people that are putting forward the message of the global communist movement. The global communist movement, they don't sound like, Bolshevik groups and Trotskyites 100 years ago, and they don't sound like wokes. The global communist movement sounds like us. You go to Venezuela, the communists in Venezuela, they sound like us, right? You go to China, the communists in China, they sound like us. You go to Russia, the communists in Russia, they sound like us. You go to Africa, the communists in Angola, the communists in South Africa, the communists in Zimbabwe, they sound like us. The Islamic revolutionaries in the Middle East, they sound like us, right? The way we talk, the updates, the understandings that we've brought, we understand 21st century socialism. We understand the city building tendency. We understand the problems of dialectics. We understand what's going on. The fact that we do that and we maintain our momentum, we continue doing what we are doing as hard as it is, and we continue to exist doing this while the global current that we represent is getting stronger. Around the world, people who believe what we believe are the majority. China, 1 in 4 human beings is in China, and the ruling ideology of China is our ruling ideology. Is our ideology. We believe in the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, the city building tendency, right? Socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is the kind of scientific understanding of socialism that we have. Right? Go to Latin America. Our kind of socialism is very widespread. You go around the world, we have a viewpoint that is the majority viewpoint in the world at this point. Among people that are highly political, understand politics, 21st century socialism, anti-imperialism, constructive, optimistic socialism, that's the majority view. However, in the West, when we are inculcated with propaganda against it, it's going to be a minority view. But we're going to keep believing it. And our forces around the world are going to keep getting stronger. And we're going to build up our community. And eventually, as things in the United States deteriorate, and things around the world in countries that have broken out of Western capitalism continue to rise, we're going to become more and more important. And other forces will emerge that start to get it, right? There'll be people within the power structure. There'll probably be people in the military who start to get it. There'll probably be people in the labor movement who start to get it. There'll probably be people, people in academia, people in different sections of society that will start to get it. Maybe it won't sound the same way we sound, but they'll start to get it. We just have to be prepared to do the hard work. That's what we have to be prepared to do.